back in 1999, supermarkets across the UK basically went to war over bread.
Oh yeah, the Great Bread War.
Right. They were aggressively slashing prices until they were, practically giving loaves away. And on the surface, that sounds fantastic for you and me. Free breakfast, basically.
It does sound like a win.
But the thing is, that ridiculously cheap loaf of bread was actually this deliberate psychological trap.
Yeah.
It was a calculated weapon used to, well, starve out competitors and quietly build monopolies.
Because the everyday transactions we just take for granted, they're underpinned by this entirely invisible architecture. Risk, logistical gambles, behavioral psychology.
Exactly.
You buy a product off the shelf, but you are really interacting with the end result of, like, 1,000 high-stakes decisions.
And that architecture is exactly what we are dissecting today. We're diving into a massive stack of notes covering the absolute nuts and bolts of enterprise and business planning.
It's a huge topic.
It is. The mission here is to just pull back the curtain on how these entities actually function. So whether you're an entrepreneur trying to scale, an employee navigating some corporate restructure, or just a consumer wondering why certain products dominate your feed, this deep dive is going to demystify the entire life cycle of a business.
Yeah, we are tracing the DNA of enterprise, right from the initial, incredibly fragile spark of an invention all the way to the brutal reality of balancing the books at the end of the year.
Because you interact with these unseen strategies constantly. The pricing model of your streaming service, the layout of your local big box store, even the way your own performance is evaluated at work, none of it is accidental.
Definitely not.
But before any of those systems can even be deployed, a business needs a catalyst, right? They need something the market actually wants.
Right. And the sources make this critical distinction right away between pure research and innovation. They treat them as fundamentally different disciplines with entirely different risk profiles.
How so?
Well, pure research is this open-ended discovery. It's usually housed in universities, operating without any specific commercial objective in mind. But innovation is the ruthless commercial exploitation of that discovery.
Okay, let's unpack this. Pure research is like wandering into an unexplored forest and, discovering a radically new, incredibly sturdy type of wood. You're just expanding the map of human knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
But innovation is actually figuring out how to mass produce a flat pack cabin out of that wood that someone will actually pay for.
That is a perfect way to put it. And making that transition from theoretical discovery to a marketable product requires R&D, research and development. And R&D is a terrifying race against your own burn rate.
It's so expensive.
It is. The text points to the Concorde jet as a prime example of this financial hazard. The foundational idea for that supersonic aircraft began in 1962, but a commercial plane wasn't delivered until 1975.
Wow.
That is 13 straight years of hemorrhaging capital before a single passenger bought a ticket.
Which totally explains why different industries treat R&D so drastically differently. Like, if you are a pharmaceutical company, you're tethered to the patent life cycle. It is innovate or die.
You have to.
Right. The moment a blockbuster drug goes generic, your revenue just plummets. So you have to fund these massive research pipelines. But a car manufacturer has the luxury of playing a wait-and-see game. They let early adopters beta test new EV tech before committing their own factories to it.
And what's fascinating here is a specific phrase from the text regarding that exact strategy. They say, it is the second mouse that gets the cheese.
Huh. Because the first mouse gets crushed by the trap of unproven market demand.
Exactly. Copycat behavior in enterprise isn't just common, it is often structurally rewarded. The pioneer takes the massive financial blow of educating the consumer and establishing the supply chains.
Right.
And if the concept proves viable, a well-capitalized competitor just swoops in, reverse engineers the successes, strips out the failures, and launches a cheaper, more refined version without all that historical R&D debt.
That makes so much sense. And once that second mouse secures the market, the imperative shifts entirely to scaling up. The notes highlight economies of scale. Basically, the phenomenon where getting larger actively makes it cheaper to operate on a per-unit basis.
Yes, the classic example from the source is a regional supermarket chain buying a television advertisement.
Right. So if a chain has 10 stores in a broadcasting region, the financial burden of that airtime is absorbed by those 10 locations.
But if you expand to 20 stores in that exact same region, the exact same marketing expenditure is now diluted across double the footprint.
So the per-store cost drops by half.
Exactly. Instantly widening the profit margin without even changing the product.
And that mathematical advantage applies to purchasing, logistics, everything. But reaching that scale introduces a new massive vulnerability because you have to physically fulfill that scaled-up demand.
Right. The underlying mechanics of production have to shift to prevent the business from collapsing under its own weight.
So how do they do that?
Well, the type of production engine you build depends entirely on the degree of standardization. The sources detail this progression from Job production, which is bespoke, labor-intensive, and inherently slow, to batch production.
Batch is like industrial ovens cycling through runs of baked goods, right?
Yes, identical items processed in stages. But true, relentless scale requires flow or mass production, the continuous assembly line. And this is where the obsession with operational efficiency peaks, specifically with the methodology of lean production and just-in-time, or JIT manufacturing.
Right, JIT.
JIT is essentially an exercise in engineered fragility. The objective is to completely eliminate the carrying costs of excess inventory. The text uses a car manufacturing plant to illustrate this.
Okay.
Under JIT, the plant actively refuses to store a month's worth of tires in a warehouse. Instead, the supplier is contracted to deliver the precise volume of tires required for one single day's production, and they have to arrive at a designated loading bay within a microscopic time window.
Wait, if you only order tires exactly when you need them, aren't you just one traffic jam away from a total disaster? I mean, there's zero margin for error there. If a truck breaks down or a port goes on strike, does the entire multi-million-dollar assembly line just grind to a halt?
It does. Production becomes entirely subservient to the reliability of the supply chain.
That sounds crazy.
But that intense vulnerability is actually a deliberate design feature. It ties directly into the Japanese philosophy of Kaizen, or continuous improvement. See, a traditional warehouse full of buffer stock actually hides supply chain flaws.
Oh, I see.
If a supplier is late, you just pull from the back room, and the systemic inefficiency is never addressed.
So by stripping away the buffer, JIT forces the pain to the surface immediately.
Exactly. And Kaizen dictates that dealing with that pain isn't about panicky, sweeping overhauls. It relies on the workers on the floor, the people actually touching the machinery, making thousands of decentralized, incremental adjustments to perfect the system.
It kind of humanizes the workplace then, by shifting the cognitive load. You aren't just a cog, you are an active engineer of your own workflow.
Yeah, exactly. But a perfectly tuned flow line requires maximum throughput to justify its existence. That introduces the brutal math of capacity utilization.
Right, the cinema example.
Yeah, the text illustrates this with a multiplex cinema. 5 screens, 150 seats each, showing one film a day. So the theoretical maximum capacity is 5,250 customers a rook.
But if they only draw 4,200 patrons in that week, they are operating with a 20% spare capacity. And in fixed-cost, heavy industries, spare capacity is toxic. The seats are empty, but the lease, the heating, the projectionist salary, those still have to be paid in full.
You have to drive utilization, yeah. But you can't just churn out garbage to fill the void. The sources emphasize W. Edwards Deming's definition that quality is exclusively defined by the customer.
Right. Dell famously codified this into their mission statement, demanding customers be pleased, not just satisfied. It's the foundation of total quality management, or TQM, pushing the responsibility for quality away from a single inspector at the end of the line and embedding it into every micro-step of the process.
Yet all of these incredibly complex systems, JIT, Kaizen, TQM, they're ultimately reliant on human psychology. The mechanical efficiency of a firm means nothing if the organizational structure chokes the workforce.
Yeah, the sources outline this evolution of corporate architecture. You start with the traditional tall pyramid structure, which features long chains of command and a narrow span of control.
Right.
The fatal flaw there is vertical communication. By the time strategic directives filter down from the executive suite to the factory floor, the market conditions that prompted them may have completely changed.
To combat that latency, firms flatten out. Fewer layers of middle management, wider spans of control. It drastically accelerates communication and empowers frontline workers, but the trade-off is a very real threat of losing central cohesion.
Which brings us to the matrix structure.
Yeah, which dismantles traditional departments entirely in favor of cross-functional project teams.
So you pull an engineer, a marketer, and a finance specialist into a pod. It shatters silos, sure, but the text points out the immediate psychological friction. You suddenly have two bosses, your functional department head and your project manager.
Yeah, that's tricky.
Navigating those competing priorities brings us directly to how leadership actually views human motivation.
And the notes lean heavily on Douglas McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y here.
Right.
Theory X managers operate on the baseline assumption that workers are inherently lazy, mediocre, and exclusively motivated by financial coercion. They believe that without rigid supervision, productivity will just instantly evaporate.
Wow.
Whereas Theory Y managers assume the exact opposite. They believe employees are ambitious, seek out responsibility, and derive intrinsic satisfaction from solving problems.
Here's where it gets really interesting. A Theory X manager is basically a helicopter parent, right? Constantly hovering over your shoulder to micromanage your homework, convinced you'll fail otherwise.
Yeah.
But a Theory Y manager is like a Montessori teacher, providing the tools and trusting you to figure out the puzzle on your own.
And the uncomfortable truth, highlighted by Fiedler's contingency model, is that neither approach is universally superior. Fiedler argues there is no one-size-fits-all leadership style.
Right, the questionnaire thing.
Yeah, he developed this questionnaire where leaders rate their least preferred coworker. How you evaluate the person you absolutely despise working with reveals whether your innate leadership style defaults to being task-oriented or relationship-oriented under severe stress.
So the context dictates the required style. Like an autocratic leader who centralizes all decision-making and demands immediate compliance, that's essential in the armed forces, or during a rapid corporate bankruptcy. But apply that same autocratic style to a room full of highly creative computer game developers, and you'll instantly crush their output. They require a democratic approach that encourages autonomy.
And to calibrate all of this, firms utilize workforce planning tools like the 360-degree appraisal, pulling performance feedback from peers, subordinates, and external stakeholders, rather than just a traditional top-down review.
It sounds incredibly thorough, but also like an absolute political minefield.
It can be. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the aggregate result of these structural and psychological choices manifests in employee relations. When a highly skilled workforce is trapped under a Theory X manager and subjected to poorly designed matrix reporting lines, the friction inevitably boils over into industrial action.
And industrial action doesn't just mean a traditional strike where everyone walks out. The text details more insidious tactics, like a work-to-rule campaign.
Work to rule is essentially the weaponization of a company's own bureaucracy. Workers refuse to go above and beyond. They execute every single procedure and safety regulation to the absolute meticulous letter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in a complex logistical environment, strict adherence to every minor, outdated rule acts as sand in the gears. It drastically throttles production output without the union ever officially going on strike or forfeiting their paychecks.
That is a brilliant, paralyzing tactic. But let's assume the structural friction is managed. The product is manufactured efficiently via Kaizen, the workforce is empowered, and the supply chain is humming.
Okay.
None of that guarantees survival if the business mismanages its portfolio or misprices its output.
Which brings us to the Boston Matrix, which is a diagnostic tool for categorizing a company's products based on market share and market growth. The text maps this out so vividly. You have your cash cows products with massive market share in mature, slow-growing markets.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes is the textbook example there, right?
Yes, it dominates the cereal aisle, it requires very little fresh marketing capital, and it reliably generates surplus cash.
Then you have the stars. High market share in an explosive, fast-growing market like the Apple iPad during the dawn of the tablet era.
Right.
But the tension really lies with the question marks, or problem children. Low market share, but in a rapidly expanding sector. The text points to Levi's jeans in the 1980s trying to capture surging new demographics.
And finally, there are the dogs. Low market share in stagnant or shrinking markets, such as traditional local pubs over the last decade. The strategic imperative of the Boston Matrix isn't just to label these products, though. It is a directive for capital allocation.
Meaning you have to move the money around.
Exactly. You must ruthlessly milk the profits from your cash cows to fund the aggressive expansion of your stars and question marks before the market leaves you behind.
But the revenue generated by those cash cows is entirely dependent on pricing strategies, and you have to know your leverage. Like, are you a price taker or a price maker?
Right.
If you farm wheat, you are a price taker. The commodity is uniform, substitutes are infinite, and you simply accept the global market rate. But if you hold a patent or a really powerful brand, you are a price maker.
And price makers have tactical options. The text outlines market skimming, which extracts maximum revenue from early adopters by setting an artificially high price for new technology, like the launch of a new Xbox, before gradually lowering it as competitors enter the space.
Yeah, and the inverse of that is penetration pricing. entering the market below the standard rate to rapidly steal market share and establish a footprint.
Then there is loss leader pricing, which brings us right back to our 1999 bread war. Supermarkets were perfectly willing to bleed money on every loaf of bread sold, knowing that the foot traffic generated would inevitably result in consumers filling their carts with high-margin items once inside the store.
But the text draws a hard legal line between a promotional loss leader and predatory or destroyer pricing. This involves a dominant firm deliberately setting prices so catastrophically low that it forces smaller competitors into insolvency.
Yeah, that's where it gets dicey.
So, wait, if a massive corporation wants to burn its own cash to sell me a product below cost, isn't that just a massive win for the consumer? I get cheap goods. Why do regulators step in to declare it illegal?
Because the consumer benefit is a temporary illusion hiding a long-term economic trap. A multinational conglomerate can absorb localized losses for years. The regional competitor cannot.
Right.
Once that smaller competitor is starved of revenue and liquidates, the conglomerate assumes monopoly control over the market. And without the gravitational pull of competition, they immediately hike prices far beyond the original baseline. The sources note how Microsoft faced intense antitrust scrutiny for bundling free software packages to suffocate rival developers.
It's market share acquired by attrition, and how those surviving products reach the consumer is also facing massive disintermediation. The notes detail the death of the middleman. Major retailers no longer rely on wholesale distributors. Their scale allows them to dictate terms directly to the manufacturers.
And direct-to-consumer internet models have compressed the supply chain even further. The text highlights ebooks as the ultimate form of distribution efficiency, eliminating printing, physical warehousing, shipping logistics, and retail shelf space markups in a single stroke.
So we have tracked the life cycle from the initial R&D gamble through JOT manufacturing, navigating Theory X managers, and strategically pricing the portfolio. But the ultimate reckoning for any enterprise doesn't happen on the factory floor or in the marketing department. It happens on the scoreboard.
The budgets and the profit margins. One of the most aggressive fiscal tools mentioned in the sources is zero budgeting.
Yeah, rather than taking last year's departmental budget and lazily adjusting it for inflation, zero budgeting resets every single ledger to £0 at the start of the fiscal year.
Every manager is forced to justify every single request for capital from scratch. It is a brutal mechanism designed to constantly interrogate whether legacy processes are actually adding value.
It totally eradicates the use it or lose it spending mentality that plagues large bureaucracies. But the ultimate arbiter of a firm's viability is the distinction between gross profit margin and net profit margin.
Yes, and the text is very careful to separate added value, which is simply the selling price minus the raw materials from the gross profit, which factors in the direct costs of production.
So what does this all mean? If we step away from the corporate jargon, gross profit margin is like looking at your gross paycheck before taxes. It makes you feel incredibly wealthy.
Right.
But net profit margin factors in the total overhead, the rent, the insurance, the administrative bloat. It is the sobering reality of what actually lands in your bank account after the world has taken its cut.
And this raises an important question. How do you objectively evaluate if a specific net profit margin is healthy? Because a fixed percentage is meaningless in a vacuum. The sources stress that context is everything here.
Yeah, give me an example.
A high-end jewelry retailer might boast a staggering gross profit margin of 60 to 80%, marking up precious metals heavily, but their inventory turnover is agonizingly slow.
Contrast that with the primary sector. A dairy farmer operates on razor-thin margins, where the wholesale price of milk barely eclipses the overhead of maintaining the herd. The text notes that while a 25% gross margin might trigger a restructuring panic at a fast food franchise, that exact same 25% margin is considered robust and highly sustainable for an industrial manufacturer of tinned vegetables operating on massive volumes.
It just shows how the entire ecosystem is deeply interconnected. The efficiency of your production line dictates your capacity.
Right.
Your capacity impacts your unit costs. Your unit costs define your pricing power in the Boston Matrix.
And all of that is utterly dependent on whether your organizational structure treats its workforce as liabilities to be managed or assets to be leveraged.
It is a stunningly complex balancing act.
It really is. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We discussed how modern, flat organizational structures empower frontline workers, but inherently risk a loss of central control. And we explored Kaizen, the system that demands constant decentralized adjustments from the people actually touching the product.
Right. The philosophy of trusting the floor.
Exactly. But if you extrapolate that, could a modern enterprise eventually become too decentralized? If you systematically strip away the pyramid of middle management and you aggressively empower different cross-functional matrix teams to constantly rewrite their own operational rules, could a company actually lose its unified identity? In the pursuit of absolute decentralized efficiency, could the engine room inadvertently tear the ship apart?
It is the ultimate tension between operational agility and strategic cohesion.
Something to think about the next time you are sitting through a 360-degree appraisal, or simply tossing a heavily discounted box of cereal into your shopping cart. You aren't just an observer, you are an active participant in this invisible, constantly evolving architecture. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.